Thank you, Paschal, and I want to welcome Ray as well to our gathering. Could I also just formally recognise and welcome representatives from Glen, Marriage Equality, Tenay, Noise, Dublin Frontrunners and Gloria, and just remind you that Dublin Frontrunners have a 5K run on the 21st of June if you feel like participating in that night. Our first speaker is Mark Kelly, who's Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. He is a renowned speaker and scholar. He's Director of the Irish Council of Civil Liberties. He's also a Commissioner Designate of the new Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, just recently appointed by Minister Shatter, and he's also co-chair of the International Network of Civil Liberties Organisations. He's an international human rights lawyer and founder of the independent consultancy firm Human Rights Consultants. And indeed, before founding HRC, he lived in Strasbourg for 10 years, where he worked as head of unit in the Secretariat of the Council of Europe's European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. In that role, he supervised the CPT's human rights monitoring and reporting activities in relation to more than a dozen Council of Europe member states, including Ireland. You'll note from his accent he's been educated in Dundee, Edinburgh, Cambridge and Columbia, and Mark has published and lectured extensively in areas of human rights and criminal justice, along with the prevention of ill treatment and combating racism. And indeed, he lectures on human rights on the European Master's degree in Human Rights and Democratisation at the European Institute in Venice. So Mark, you're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry, for that introduction. You've probably heard more than enough about me, actually, already. That's the long version of the biography. So I'm also not going to take any great length of time to talk about the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, because I think most of you are aware of the organisation and what it does. We've been around since 1976, so heading for 40 years at this point. Originally founded by Mary Robinson, but also by people like Kader Asmal, the anti-apartheid activist who was in exile in Dublin at the time, but went on to be a minister in the first democratic government in South Africa. And we remember him particularly on today, which is Freedom Day, the celebration of the independence of South Africa as a democratic state. One of the things that the ICCL has been doing consistently during the past 37 years is it has been working on issues of equality, and specifically equality for all forms of family, including LGBT couples. And what I wanted to do this afternoon is just spend a little bit of time picking up on what Jerry was saying and reflecting on some of the progress that has been made recently in that area. And I'm thinking specifically of progress that's been made even in the last year since you had your inaugural meeting. Then I want to turn to look at some of the challenges that remain by which we're still confronted. And then I want to finish briefly by looking at the question of what can we do? What can we do together to make sure that those challenges are effectively confronted? I think the progress in the last year has been really crystal clear for anyone to see. By any standards, civil partnership has been a hugely significant success. Hundreds of civil partnerships have taken place across the length and breadth of the country, and they've genuinely been celebrated as part of the life of the communities in which they've been taking place. And just before Christmas, we were very happy to be able to launch, together with Glen, a new guide to the rights of same-sex couples, which was launched by the Chief Justice in the Four Courts, which is really not something that you could have imagined taking place even 5 or 6 years ago. And then, of course, just 2 weeks ago, we had the Convention on the Constitution. And I want at that point to pay particular tribute to the work of this group, the contribution of this group to the thinking of the Convention on the Constitution, and in particular to Jerry Buttimer for all of the careful, considered, thoughtful and compassionate work done, both in terms of lobbying and advocacy, but also in terms of the human dimension, the contact with other members of the Convention on the Constitution. I think that was massively important. There was a headline-grabbing figure after the vote of 79% in favour of marriage for same-sex couples being introduced into the Constitution. And of course that was a great result, but I think it's also important to reflect on two other votes that followed the main vote that got less attention. Because delegates were not only asked, did they favour the introduction of marriage for same-sex couples, they were also asked, if it's brought in, how do you want it to be brought in? In what way do you want it to be brought in? And they were given two options. It could be permissive, on the one hand, so the Constitution might say that the state may, in future, enact laws making provision for marriage for same-sex couples, or it can be directive, the state shall. So there's an obligation, a strict obligation to do it following on a referendum vote. And the result was crystal clear in favour of a directive shall requirement, 78%. And the third vote was even more interesting, because the third vote asked delegates if they agreed, disagreed, or had no opinion around the statement that having regard to changed arrangements in relation to marriage, so this is after a vote in the referendum, do you agree, disagree, or have no opinion that the state should enact laws incorporating changed arrangements in relation to parentage, guardianship, and the upbringing of children? And the vote on that question was actually higher than either of the other two. 81% said yes to that. So the members of the Convention on the Constitution obviously include at least one very fair-minded person who didn't actually vote in favour of same-sex marriage, but if it were to happen, recognised that there had to be consequent legal changes in the situation of children and guardianship and so on. So massive change, tangible change reflected in public opinion polls and public attitudes. But let's just speak a little bit about the equality challenges that remain. And I have 6 in all, but I'm going to go through them at a cracking pace. Firstly, civil partnership is not equivalent to full civil marriage. If you look at our Know Your Rights guide, and there are copies available here, you'll see a comparative table, and you'll see that it is, in very, very many respects, extremely similar to civil marriage, but it's not equivalent to full civil marriage. There are gaps, there are equality gaps, and certainly, as far as the ICCL is concerned, equality is a binary condition. Either you're equal or you're not. You can't be almost equal. You're either equal or you're not. And this is a gap that must be closed and must be addressed on foot of the vote in the Constitutional Convention. And the tide of history is with us on this. Only this week, France introduced laws making it legal for same-sex couples to marry. And within the past couple of days, the US state of Rhode Island did the same, as a result of which the whole of the region of New England is now completely free of that particular form of discrimination against same-sex couples. But it's also true that homophobic hate crime and intolerance remain an issue. Thankfully, we have been spared the kind of backlash that has been seen in France in association with the introduction of the new law. But there's absolutely no room for complacency where this is concerned. Next week, there will be a report by the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, the FRA, which will show that of 93,000 respondents across the whole of the EU, 25% of them have experienced some form of hate crime or violence as a result of their LGBT status. And that's a big number that we need to be acutely conscious of as we move from the Convention on the Constitution into an environment in which we're looking at a referendum campaign. And nor are the rights of transgendered persons in Ireland properly respected and protected. It's really quite incredible to me that 16 years after she first began legal proceedings and fully 6 years after the High Court produced a declaration of incompatibility with the European Convention on Human Rights, Dr. Lydia Foy still does not have a birth certificate showing her female gender. And this is really serious, not just for Lydia Foy and other people in her position, but because the ongoing failure by the government to act on a declaration of incompatibility under the 2003 European Convention on Human Rights Act calls into question the credibility of that act as an effective remedy when violation occurs. And it also leaves a question mark hanging over the respect that the government has for the European Convention on Human Rights itself. And our equality legislation continues to contain sweeping exemptions, in particular in relation to the notion of religious ethos. There was a very interesting case from the European Court of Human Rights in January of this year called IWIDA against the UK. This was the case about the British Airways staff member who had been told not to wear a crucifix to work. And what that case does is it draws a really helpful, bright line between the right to religious freedom and the right to freedom from discrimination. The Strasbourg court quite rightly upheld the right to express and manifest faith in the public sphere, a right that should never be restricted without an objective and rational justification, and only then by proportionate means. However, it drove home the point that individual conscience or religious belief, however sincerely held, does not provide a free pass from the requirements of anti-discrimination law. Except that in Ireland, it still does. Because in Ireland, we still have Section 37 of the Employment Equality Acts, which continue to have a direct and detrimental effect on lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender persons. It's a section that is designed to allow schools and other institutions to maintain their religious ethos, but in fact, it provides a legal license for schools under religious control to discriminate against openly LGBT teachers and indeed against teachers who come from other forms of non-traditional family. Striking a balance in this area is essential, as the Strasbourg court has recently underlined, but the current balance simply is not fair. Fifthly, reform of our human rights and equality infrastructure is an unfinished project. And Jerry made reference to the fact that I've recently been appointed as a Commissioner Designate of the new Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. I'm speaking today in my ICCL capacity, and indeed the new Commission will meet only for the first time next week in a shadow capacity. But I can certainly assure you that as a Commissioner, I will be doing absolutely everything that I can to ensure that the new Commission realises its potential to become a truly credible, independent and influential voice for human rights, and that equality issues will be at the very core of its mandate. And lastly, and I really cannot address an audience like this on a subject like equality without alluding to this. The current debate on the reproductive justice rights of women, and more specifically on their constitutional right to a lawful termination, raises equality issues of the very gravest kind. And in particular, the constitutional right of women to lawful termination in the circumstances identified by the Supreme Court in the X case and by the European Court of Human Rights in the case of A, B and C against Ireland are not being respected. You would think, listening to this debate, that things were other than they are. But in fact, legally speaking, abortion has been lawful in Ireland since the X case judgment in 1992. And 2.5 years ago, the Strasbourg court found that there was what it called a striking discordance between the theoretical right to a lawful abortion on grounds of a relevant risk to the woman's health and the reality of its practical implementation. And I think, as we all now know, that's putting it mildly, because in fact the legal position at the moment in Ireland is that a woman must be quite literally at death's door before medical practitioners consider that they can carry out a lawful termination. The A, B and C judgment of the Strasbourg Court is binding on Ireland, and our laws must be brought into line with our obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. And that's the absolute bare minimum. The fact that that is the bare minimum shouldn't preclude us, in my view, from looking at reform in other areas, in particular around risk to health and the situation of women who have diagnoses of fatal fetal abnormalities. So those are just some of the half dozen challenges in the equality area that I still see in front of us. And I want to finish briefly by reflecting on what we can do about it and what we might be able to do together. On the day of that other party's Ardèche, I think maybe it's interesting to recall that it was Dermot Ahern who brought through the Civil Partnership Bill with all-party consent, and it was Dermot Ahern that signed it into law. So what I'm wondering today, as I spend this time with you, is for what advances in the equality area will Minister Alan Shatter be remembered? More specifically, or more generally rather, what will be the equality legacy of this particular Fine Gael-dominated coalition? I think the signs are promising, at least in terms of the rhetoric. And I want to wrap up by quoting to you something that Alan Shatter said when he spoke before the United Nations Universal Periodic Review, the UPR process, before the United Nations in Geneva. He said, "It's our belief that it is a universal human rights requirement that government must act towards each person on the basis, first, that he or she has an irreducible, non-tradable intrinsic value, and second, that he or she has a sovereign right and responsibility for achieving an authentic life of character and value for himself or herself, consistent with others having a similar right." And so it's never acceptable for any government, and these are still his words, to treat national or religious or ethnic minorities as inferior, to discriminate against women or gay men or gay women, or to discriminate against children, or to fail to recognise their vulnerability. And on the question of human rights, there is no room for moral relativism or selectivity. Respect for dignity and human rights that secures that bedrock value is the incontestable baseline of decent politics everywhere. It is also crucial, he concluded, that states which ask human rights questions of others stand on a sound foundation of protecting human rights of their own citizens. And more concretely, Minister Shatter has spoken strongly in favour of equal marriage, of women's reproductive justice rights, and he has given a commitment to support the strengthening of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and indeed at a very early stage in its inception, to ask it to carry out a review of Section 37 of the Employment Equality Acts that I referred to previously. So it really seems to be that the issue that confronts this is not necessarily a lack of political commitment, but a question of whether sufficient political impetus exists to translate that commitment into practice. And I think, to be honest with you, that's a question that is particularly pressing, given that it is also clear that there is a small but increasingly vocal cohort within your own party which is openly opposed to progressive social change. And for me, really, that's where you come in. Party activists, people committed to the party who will take the time to attend meetings in hotels on Saturday afternoons. You're the lifeblood of any political party. And through movements like this and groups like this, your party must and should be prepared also to listen to you, so that working together for the future, we can achieve an Ireland that is more equal than it has ever been in the past, and also pin down a long-standing and durable equality legacy for Fine Gael. Thank you very much.